Good afternoon, everybody, and so we start session 3. It's a great privilege that I should stand here. Many of you won't have a clue who I am. My name is John Brooke. I'm a historian of science, primarily, with great interest in the historical relations between science and religion, one of Professor Ihsanoglu's special interests too, and I have had the great privilege of working with him on certain projects over a period now going back 25 years. So it's an honor for me to introduce him as our first speaker this afternoon. It's an old cliche, isn't it, that when one is introducing a distinguished speaker, one begins by saying that they need no introduction. If ever there were a case where that is appropriate and not a cliche, this would be it, because of course to an Al-Furqan audience, Professor Ihsanoglu is just so hermetically sealed in a way to this project, to its existence. And I think one should just make the point that he has enormous distinction as having founded the science, it's sometimes said, founded the science of Islamic science. His work on the scientific heritage of the Ottoman Empire is of enormous distinction, and I was privileged just a year ago to attend a symposium in his honor at Harvard, where the recent English translation of his big 3-volume work on the scientific heritage of the Ottoman Empire was very much at the fore of our thinking. I should just say also that work has been described as pioneering, monumental, original, and revelatory. And his writing on the selective transfer of European science into the Ottoman culture has been exceptional and highly praised. So today, with the focus on language and translation, his subject is creating modern Ottoman terminology. So, Ekmel, if you can hear me, we are missing you, but we are delighted that you are nevertheless with us. I've been asked to say that you have 30 minutes for the talk, and if you go on beyond that, I shall become aggressive and try to stop you, but without success, I suspect. Over to you.
Well, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, first and foremost, I am grateful for Professor John Brooke for his kind words, and he's spoiling me, but he's encouraging me also as a landmark scholar in the history of science and religion worldwide. And he has been kind to cooperate with us for many projects. It is an honor to be a colleague and friend of Professor John Brooke. Unfortunately, I had a problem yesterday, visa problem, etc. I have this passport for 30 years, and this is the first time I asked to give more papers because the regulations changed in the country. And anyhow, the Furqan colleagues were very kind to arrange this Zoom lecture. I'm grateful to them. as you said, John, the important part of scientific literature is the terminology, and terminology is crucial in transferring knowledge from one language to the other language. The Ottomans in the classical period had no problem in translation because they were with the domain of three languages, Al-Sinai Salasa, namely Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. And despite the three languages, the Al-Sinai Salasa of the Ottomans were from different categories, Oral Altaic, Indo-European, and Semitic. They went very well, and they created a big terminology around Arabic definitions and Arabic words. And Ottoman scholars were comfortable with this, so they could read Arabic, they could read Persian, and can translate from among the three languages. But when it came to deal with the Western literature, translations from European languages, they were faced with a new challenge. Words they don't have in their vocabulary, and they have to find equivalent to it that they can be part of their language. Ottoman Turkish was developing since Ottomans came to Anatolia, to Istanbul, and the scientific language of Ottoman Turkish became developed that certain dictionaries would appear. And this mostly in medicine, because medicine was very much developed. You can see from this, can we change the next, please? The first Ottoman Turkish medical dictionary was anonymous, but the oldest surviving copy is from 1556, and it describes the Turkish equivalents for the names of Arabic, Persian, and Greek herbs. Arabic and Persian and Turkish, they are Al-Sinai Salasa, and Greek here, either it is Greek classic or Greek from the community which is living in the Ottoman Empire, which was the biggest community among non-Muslims. The second one, or the oldest surviving copy, as I said, this is second one, Hazar Fen Hüseyin Efendi, 17th century. And he provides Turkish names for medicines, followed by their Arabic, Persian equivalents. So here within the three languages. The old surviving copy is 1730. Then we have Hekim İsa Sakızı, who comes from Kos Island. Kos Island, now it belongs to Greece, and Sakız is the Turkish. He was a famous scholar, graduated in Padua. Sakız İsa gives the names of medicines in Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, Latin, Greek, Syriac, Spanish, Hungarian, French, Italian, and Hindi and Berber. 12 languages. When we look to Arabic, Persian, it's okay. Turkish is okay. Hebrew, because of the Jews who came from Andalusia after the Inquisition. Latin, of course, reference language. Syriac, also. Spanish, again, they have this connection with the immigrant scholars. French, very strange French to appear here, 17th century, middle of 17th century. And Italian. Hindi. We don't know what does it mean by Hindi, and Berber. For me, Berber is very interesting because this means the Ottoman Empire, as it expands west, it comes to Algiers and stops there the relation, the official relation. But this means that there were Berber population whom the author was caring for, and he did this. Now, the Turkish language developed as a language of science, and as I said, when it counterparts the European subjects, lack of terminology was the problem. Katib Çelebi, very famous, polymath, not polyglot. He translated books from Latin to Turkish through intermediate, who is introducing him as a Muslim, as a convert, French scholar who knew Latin very well, and he helped him by translating from Latin to Turkish, and he himself would put it in a proper Turkish. So that is geography, and in geography, there was no problem of terminology too much. But when it comes to medicine, we have a big problem because many discoveries, many innovations, many new drugs, many organs discovered because of anatomy was allowed, etc., etc. Now, in the early modern period, prominent translators such as Shanizadeh, who passed away in 1826, and later Ishaq Effendi, the chief instructor of the Imperial College of Engineering, they did on their own many coinage of new words and created a rich vocabulary. This is the Imperial College of Engineering in Istanbul, and there is another photograph here. Anyhow, it will come. And then they were taught in French, and they were taught to use French reference books on mathematics and engineering. And the difference here, and this is in early 19th century, it was individual aspects by Ishaq Effendi and others. And others. Now, and it seems that Ishaq Effendi was a dominant person and he considered as an authority. When it came to medicine, there were many physicians who were translating books or compiling books, and they made their own dictionaries, like لغات طب أفرنجي, the dictionary of Afranji medicine. Afranji means European. It has a medical terminology from Latin into Turkish and Arabic. قاموس طبي by Abdullah Mullah, who died 1866, written in 1267, 1850, particular importance for providing Turkish and French equivalents of Arabic medical expressions. Here is the Sultan Mahmud II, who inaugurated the Imperial Military School of Medicine, مكتبة طبية شاهانة. And the country, the army, was in a need to physicians and operators. The old way of producing them was no longer fruitful. And he established this and made a condition that teaching would be in French. We need immediately a good number of physicians to help the country. That was the order or the instruction of the Sultan. So the Imperial Medical School, Military School, was founded in 1839 at Galatasaray. And he brought an Austrian doctor, Bernard, to teach in French and to be the director or the dean of the school. Teaching in French went up from 1839 up to 1871, was all in French. Then a debate started between the students, the Turkish students, and the Turkish professors with the Europeans, Francophones from Europe or Francophones from those who were living in Istanbul. The first discussion about the national language started in 1850. And you can see the debate recorded in the Gazette Imperial, the Journal Imperial, no, Journal Médical de l'Empire Ottoman. It's published in French and very rare to find it. A few years back, about 20, 25 years or 30 years back, with one of my assistants who knows French well, we did write an essay on that. And I encourage those who are interested in these subjects to go through this discussion between the two. So the Francophone physicians, on the other hand, gathered under the Société Impériale de Médecins, established in 1856. The Muslims, they established Jamiyat Ilmiya Tabbiya Osmaniya, Ottoman Medical Society. Now, with the low production of the school, the Ottoman government started to be worried about that. There were only a few graduates every year with big number on the first and second levels of the school. So the movement of the students to force in Turkish, then the French or the Francophone people would say, but you don't have a dictionary, you don't have a terminology. They made their decision and worked through the Ottoman Medical Society, and they started to coin medical terms. And this, they had a rule for themselves. They said, Europeans, when they have something new discover, they use Greek and Latin words. And for us here in Istanbul, it is Arabic and Persian. This is the major languages that we rely on. And they brought a big number of classic Arabic medical books like Ibn Sina's Al-Qanun fi al-Tibb, Al-Hawi, Razi, التصريف لمن عجز عن تأليف to Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi, and many others. And they studied them, and they brought the Turkish new translation made in the last one century or so, and the Arabic books of medical school in Cairo during Mehmed Ali Pasha, which was under a French physician called Claude, and he was given the Bey title from the governor, and he is known until today as Claude Bey. So they brought all these Arabic books and studying them in very systematic way, and they finished, and they chose French, one French dictionary, which was the wider used in Europe, and made its translation. You see here, by 1870, it was clear that the Imperial School of Medicine still could not meet the nation's need for physicians, and that education had not reached the desired level. Sources indicate that despite heavy expenditure over the nearly 40 years since its foundation, the school produced, on average, only 7 physicians per year, emphasizing the need for urgent measure. Yes, please. Well, the dictionary made by the members of the Ottoman Medical Society was a groundbreaking endeavor, and it's published in 1873. I will show you now in a moment. Yes, the first edition was 1873. We got it to be a medical dictionary, which contained in an organized form the terminology pertaining to all medical sciences. The preparation of this dictionary took 3 years. And as I said, the French reference book was Nistan's book or dictionary. Yes, this is the Arabic book, classic books they used. Yes. Meanwhile, they used available dictionaries, European and Oriental. Dictionaries compiled by Bianchi, French, Hancheri, and Kazmirsky were examined, but these proved of limited benefit. Menensky's trilingual dictionary, Latin, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, however, was used extensively. Other dictionaries like Wankulu, Ahtari, Burhan Kati, Lehje Osmani, and most notably Asim Efendi's translation of Kamus al-Muhit. For nearly quarter century, this Lugat al-Tibbiyah remained the sole medical dictionary in use among Ottoman physicians. Over time, however, its shortcoming and inadequacies became apparent. The review commission of the Imperial School of Medicine prepared an expanded second edition of the French-Turkish medical based on the latest enlarged version of Nistan's work. And the second edition came out in 1900 under the title of Lugat al-Tibb, Dictionary of Medicine, in commemoration of the 25th anniversary of Sultan Abdul Hamid's second accession to the throne. In this presentation, we will argue that these young Ottoman physicians, drawing from both classical and Islamic medical sources and contemporary French medical literature, established a systematic principles for the derivation of new scientific terms. This is the new part of, here you are on the left, the first edition in 1873, and on the right, the second in 1900. And both are compiled by the Ottoman Medical Society. Now, this is the first on the left, right. Compare how only one small explanation and sometimes no explanation. Here in the second edition, you see that every title, every item is given very long expression. Now, when we look to how they did this dictionary, there are 5 aspects that we can present analyze the dictionary. First aspect that they adopted the vocabulary already known at the time when they started selecting their terminology. Some of this terminology was taken from the works of translator physicians such as Johann ibn Musawi and Hunayn ibn Ishaq al-Abadi in the Abbasid time, early translations from ancient nations, Greek and others. I'm giving the Arabic names of references. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, one a little. Biraz arka. Tamam. Now, they used the terminology given in these Arabic classic books. But when it came to find 2 words, they have to make a preference. For instance, for arteria maxima, known in English as aorta and in French as aorta. For instance, they used the word abhar, which was used by Ali ibn al-Abbas al-Majusi. And there was al-aorti, which was used by Ibn Sina. So when we notice here that in some of them, texts, some of the texts, they use abhar and aort. When it comes for sub-entries, they preferred abhar. So they can say تصديق أبهر, استرخاء أبهر, تصلب أبهر, تعظم أبهر, and they don't use a word. Now we come to the second aspect. They used the Arabic names of the human body, organs, side by side with the original Turkish names. Then they settled for the Arabic words whenever they used compound terms. So compound terms are different issue. For the English word liver and French foie, 2 words were mentioned, kabid and karaciğer. Karaciğer is the Turkish word. Kabid is the Arabic word. Yes. No. In derived compound terms, Arabic words only were used such as وجع كبدي, انسداد كبد, شريان كبد, فئات كبدي, مجراي كبد, etc., etc. For instance, kulunç kebidi, hepatic colic. سل كبدي, liver tuberculosis. داء الأفرنج كبدي, hepatic syphilis. Third aspect, they coined many terms which no physician from previous generations used. For instance, they used iltihab for what we call now inflammation. Although former physicians used the term waram to indicate both inflammation and what we call al-waram as equivalent to tumor. But the Ottomans distinguished between the two terms. For instance, we see in the Arabic language lexicon, Lisan al-Arab, taqassu, which they coined as an equivalent to the French term abside, where in the Lisan al-Arab it says تقصع النمل الدمل بالصديد إذا امتلأ. Yes, I'm not giving all of this because they mentioned numerous kinds of rail such as al-kharkhara al-yabisa, al-kharkhara al-faqa'iyya, al-mukhatiya, etc., etc. They also mentioned various kinds of bruit such as bruit de Kalguma, الزئير الصفيقي. I really don't know what صفيقي means. They use the diminutive case in generating a good number of words, such as al for glandulus, al-ghudaydat, al-qusaysat, al-qulayawat, al-husaylat, al-habibat, al-jasimat, al-jazir, and many others. We cannot give all examples because there are thousands of them. The fourth aspect, they did not use much of Arabization. That is to say, verbal Arabization of foreign terms. They endeavored to find out Arabic equivalents instead. Sometimes they wrote down the Arabized word next to the Arabic word they suggested as a replacement for the European word. For example, for cholera, they coined haida. For rheumatism, they coined rosia. For Arabization of anatomical terms, they added nothing to those already Arabicized by physicians of Islamic civilization. However, they did a lot of Arabization in chemical terms, although they tried hard to derive equivalent terms from Arabic. I will give example now. For acid, they said hamad. For acid, cinnamic, they called hamad kirfa. For acetic, they called hamad khal. For acid sulfuric, they called hamad kibrit. And until today, in schools, students, until today, they say hamad kibrit, hamad khal, hamad fa. Fifth aspect, and last one, they created prefixes and suffixes and to create a new terminology. Surely such prefixes and suffixes have great value in translating from the languages which are written in Latin characters and are rich in terminology which is formulated by means of using such Greek and Latin prefixes and suffixes.
Well, forgive me interrupting, but you have 5 minutes more, if you can manage that.
Okay. I won't go, just show you for anti, for instance, they used mudad shahwat, dafi or dafi. Yes, go ahead, please. I hope when this is published, you can go through them. Now, with this big dictionary and translating and creating new terms, teaching at the Imperial School in Istanbul turned to be in Turkish. Meanwhile, the second medical school, established in 1903 in Damascus, also started teaching in Istanbul, in Turkish. And when the French came, they closed down the medical school, but the Syrian graduates of the school and the professors say, we will open the school. They said, you have no scientific language. They said, we have. They said, well, how come? They said, we have the Ottoman terminology, which was originally Arabic, and turning it to Arabic is no problem, not at all. So the French did not accept, but after a while, they accept and they started teaching medicine in Arabic. And until today, excuse me, until today, the only university in the Arab world in 22 countries that teach medicine in Arabic is Damascus University. The rest either French or English according to the background. One other important aspect of this terminology is that when the King Nader visited Istanbul of Afghanistan and visited the university, he wanted to have a university which he calls also like Istanbul University, Dar al-Funun. And there he asked the Turkish professors to establish a medical school and hospital. And they did. And when I inquired how they did this, they were using this terminology which I spoke now, and they put it in a Persian context. And it went very well. In Turkey, this terminology was used until the great or the radical inqilab of Turkish language, and they abandoned it. So this is the experience of Ottoman Turks in creating a medical dictionary for the use of other Muslim nations. Would it be Arabic? Would it be Persian? Would it be anything else? This is all in all, I think. Maybe there are some questions, but before I end, Mr. Chairman, allow me to to express about one of our ideas. Now, today and 2 years ago, we have been working on this issue of translation from the West to the Ottomans, etc., etc. And if we look back, we find that it is 17th century Katib Çelebi's books are the first, and they went on and on in many fields. So they have a great number of translated books, difference in or started from Latin to Turkish or Arabic, then it included many other languages. I think this translation movement, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, deserve more close study. And when I compare this with the first translation movement in history of Islam, the one took place at the Abbasid era, where sciences and philosophy from Greek, from Syriac, from Hindu, from Sanskrit, from Pahlavi, were translated and known as Ulum al-Awail, and then philosophy, of course. Here we have the other side, the Ottoman movement is more versatile than the Abbasid. And I think there are certain parallels, there are differences, of course, but why not to care more about the Ottoman translation movement? And I think Al-Furqan was kind enough to pave the way for such endeavor. Why we don't think through different institutions, your own departments and others, to give more time, more energy, more thought, and more PhD theses on this subject. This is just an idea which I wanted to share with my colleagues. Thank you very much, John, for your generosity and not being tough with me.
I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Professor Johann Strauss, who spent much of his career in Strasbourg, but he's an international figure of renown. And over lunch, I learnt that he is held in the highest regard as essentially one of the real foundation scholars for work on the translation and for the history of the Turkish language and for the history of printing, publishing and cultural contracts within the Ottoman Empire. So, may I call you to come? And the title of his paper is Who Translated What in the Ottoman Empire?
But first of all, I would like to thank Professor Brooke for his kind presentation, and of course the organizers of this conference, and in particular Sali Shehsivari, which did so much to organize it, who is almost hemsheri, one could say, from the southern part of the European continent, and I'm very happy to be among the scholars from all parts of the Islamic world. Now, who translated what in the Ottoman Empire? I have to admit it is a bit a reference to a paper I have written some time ago, Who Read What in the Ottoman Empire, and which was, as it has been said, quite successful. I don't know whether this will be the case also with this presentation. Despite a continually growing number of studies on translation in the Ottoman context, relatively little interest has been shown in the translators. In this presentation, various categories of translators and their works shall be presented, among these converts, members of the non-Muslim minorities, Greeks, later Armenians, Ottoman Muslim scholars, and the various men of letters and literati active after the second half of the 19th century. These categories are often linked to a certain period, to types of texts, scholarly, scientific, literary, to certain methods of translation, or even to specific source languages. I also shall deal in this paper with translations into Turkish, because of course there were many translations into other languages in this polyglot empire. But this can be justified, although many languages were spoken in the Ottoman Empire and a few written. Within this language spectrum, the Turkish language played a pivotal role. The more so since Turkish was, the same as Arabic, a language used by several religious communities, both Muslims and Christians. However, there was an important distinction, or is an important distinction. Whereas the Arabophones of both creeds eventually used, as we know, the same script, this was not the case among the Turkophones. Non-Muslims stuck to the use of the script of what they considered their national language, i.e. the Greek or Armenian characters. We therefore have to distinguish during the period under investigation between two different strands in the translation activity and, to some extent perhaps, also between two different types of translators. The frontiers between these two strands eventually became less rigid, but remained essentially intact until the end of the Ottoman Empire. Concerning the chronology, there was also a time lag up to several decades. For example, the first attempts at translations of literary works from Western languages were made by non-Muslim translators. In the second half of the 19th century, we can see a certain convergence between non-Muslim and Muslim translators as far as the corpus of translated works was concerned, and occasionally even the script barrier was overcome. The contribution of these non-Muslim translators to the Ottoman translation movement was twofold. We have to distinguish between those who had in mind a non-Muslim audience and those translating, often on command, for a Muslim readership in Arabic script. It is perhaps unsurprising that non-Muslims played a significant role at the beginnings of the Ottoman translation movement from Western languages in the late 18th, early 19th century, when these translations appeared for the first part in print. Now this is, of course, there are many translations that have remained manuscript. These translators faced, however, considerable problems to master the elaborate Ottoman literary language. So the source language was well known, but the target language was a problem. One needed a very good hoja, to study it. Apart among the non-Muslim translators, Greeks, the so-called Phanariots, usually dragomans, were particularly conspicuous in the 18th, early 19th centuries. Among the most prominent translators were the dragomans Constantin Ypsilanti, 1760 to 1816, the translator of military treatises by Vauban, this famous architect and military writer, and especially Iakovos Argyropoulos, Yakovaki Effendi, 1776 to 1850, whose history of Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, Katerine Tarihi, was to enjoy particular popularity. It's very interesting to see that initially the Ottomans were mainly interested in two topics, of which most researchers are not aware. First of all, Russia. How did Russia manage to become a modern state? And secondly, Napoleon Bonaparte. The pioneering work of these dragomans is remarkable, since they adopted perfectly the Ottoman style, usually known as insha, to make it palatable for an Ottoman readership. These translations were made on command by the Sultan, Selim III. Some of them were printed in Istanbul, but Yakovaki Effendi's Turkish version of Castera's Histoire de Catherine II, Impératrice de Russie, was among the first translations printed in Muhammad Ali's Egypt, where such modern works were then most welcome to be printed by the newly established Bulak press. After the downfall of Selim III, there was a sort of still stand in the Ottoman Empire, and the modern Reformist state was Egypt under Muhammad Ali. Another category of translators supposed to have special competences were the converts, in particular the educated among these former prisoners who had acquired a solid knowledge of Latin, by then the major Western language. I was very grateful to hear Professor Nadavi to use this Latin world, because it was really until the 19th century a Latin world with a common scientific language. Among the most fascinating figures during the period under investigation is the Polish convert and Bash terjüman Ali Ufki Bey, alias Albertus Bobovius or Bobowski, 1610 to 1675. He not only translated the Bible into Ottoman Turkish, but also other works, among these Amos Comenius, the famous Czech educationalist, Encyclopedia Janua Linguarum Reserata, of which a manuscript is preserved in Paris. Another outstanding figure was Ibrahim Müteferrika, whose Christian name is still unknown. This Hungarian convert is mainly known as the person who introduced printing in Arabic script in the Ottoman Empire. But Müteferrika, a well-educated person, was also a gifted translator, from Latin, of course. He translated Raimondo Montecuccoli's Commentari Bellici, or Bellici, Harp Feninedaer, the first in a series of translations on European warfare. Müteferrika also produced an abridged version of the Polish Jesuit Jan Tadeusz Krusinski's Chronicle of the Afghan Wars in Persia, which he had printed himself. Now this is interesting because this Turkish version was then translated in several European languages, not from Latin. Due to the scarcity of translations from Western language until the 18th century, the first individuals engaged in this activity are in general well known. But now we have a much greater choice, so to speak, and it is also the time where the first Muslim translators from Western languages appear. And as we know, all of us, scholars, the learned, due to their curiosity, have always been more willing to look for sources and information in languages even outside the dominant culture. For example, in medieval Europe, some people learned Arabic. We therefore also find Ottoman Muslim scholars whose linguistic competence did not remain limited to a knowledge of Arabic and Persian. Among the best examples is the outstanding 17th century Ottoman scholar Katip Çelebi, just mentioned by Ekmeleddin Ihsanoglu, who wrote his works in Arabic and Turkish, but who was apparently also able to read and translate from Latin with the help of a convert. With the first opening to the West during the rule of Selim III, 1789 to 1807, the so-called Nizam-i-Jadid, Muslims became more visible in this translation activity. Some of them were still converts, but local converts, Greeks or maybe Slavs, Yahya Naci Effendi Bulgarzade, Başhoca Isaac Effendi, born in Epirus, but others were Ottoman intellectuals who grew up in the more and more cosmopolitan and polyglot environment of Istanbul, that such as Şahnizade, equally mentioned by Professor Ihsanoglu, primarily known as historian Vakanuvis, whose remarkable achievements in the domain of translation are well known. Even for his chronicle, Ottoman Chronicle, he used Voltaire's article Histoire in the Encyclopédie. Moreover, Shahnizadeh was a polyglot. He was able to translate from different source languages, Latin, Italian, and French. Incidentally, the first translation printed in Bulak was a translation by Shahnizadeh, Prusya Kralı II. Frederick'in generallerini askeri talimatı. So the instructions given by Frederick the Great, or second, to his officers. Among the Turkish-speaking Christians, attempt to translate work from Western languages had started relatively early, but a great deal of them was religious or theological in nature. Although we can detect from time to time also works that can be considered as literary, philosophical, historical, or rather rarely scientific. They were usually made from the national language, from Greek, or the one dominating in the local environment, such as the translations from Italian, popular among the Mekhitarist monks in Venice, the Armenian community. But all of their members came, or nearly all of them, came from Istanbul. These works were to constitute a sort of proper canon, i.e. most of them would have been of little, if any, interest for a Muslim readership. But among the translators we find exceptional individuals, such as the Stambuliot Johannes Jeremian, 1767 to 1835, first dragoman of the Danish legation in Istanbul, Danimarka Baştercümane, who left various, sometimes very voluminous translations, of 800 pages, several oratorios by the Austrian court poet known as Metastasio, Edward Young's Night Thoughts from the French, and most impressive, the Roman history from the foundation of the city of Rome to the destruction of the Western Empire by Oliver Goldsmith. So an English or British author, but it was translated from the Italian version. So Italian was, let's say, until 1830, the principal Western language known in the Ottoman Empire by all communities. Particularly interesting is his translation of Giuseppe Costantini's Lettere Critiche, critical letters, a kind of behavioral handbook published in Armeno-Turkish in 1837, where Jeremian outlines in the preface his ideas and the problems encountered in translating this work into Turkish. For example, how to find an equivalent for critical. And then he explains why he chose the word which does not exist in Turkish, fasılkâri mektubler. Okay, in the second half of the 19th century, these minorities did not play the same role. There was no need more for translators as when the Phanariots had this charge. But there is at least one person one has to mention, the most prominent one, Theodor Kasap. Theodor Kasap was a native of Kayseri, and he presented the Turkish reading public with the first translation of a real novel, yani hakiki bir roman, Dumas Pere's Monte Cristo. Theodor Kasap was perhaps the only non-Muslim having played a significant role in Ottoman intellectual history that may be compared to that of certain Arab Christians during the Nahda. The Karamanlı translators also underwent a change that we may call secularization of the translation activity, and they produced more and more secular works, i.e. translations from French novels, for example, as their Muslim countrymen did. The dominating figure among them was Evangelinus Misailidis, 1820-1890, publisher of the Anatolie paper. Anatolie in Greek is east, both east and Anatolia. And Anadolu, the Turkish word, comes from the Greek. A multi-talented writer who also translated many Western works. But the source language was often Greek, even in the case of French novels. One of his works was hailed for a while as the first Turkish novel, but eventually it proved to be an adaptation of a Greek work. Armenians were to some extent substituting the Phanarios for a while by publishing pioneering translations on hitherto unknown subjects, such as the following. The first translation of a historical work by Voltaire, the history of Peter the Great. As I said, Russia was fascinating the Ottomans. And the first translation of a work on political economy. Now, political economy was also extremely interesting because it was a new science. It was not medicine or anything else, and there is a vast amount of works on political economy in the following. So this was a translation of the Catéchisme d'économie politique by a French author. And eventually the first translation of a work on Western philosophy by Johannes Strauss. This was once more translated from the Italian from Pasquale Galuppi's Elementi di Filosofia. And this was really a sensation. And the great historian Ahmed Cevdet Pasha wrote a takris, a elogious preface, where he spoke that now we do not learn any more things about al-mantiq al-atiq, but the ideas of the falasifa al-ifranj. So this was a landmark to some extent, although the name of the translator was not mentioned on the book. And then we have also translation published in Armenian script, so secular ones. For example, the first translation of a comedy by Molière, Médecin malgré lui, or Zore la Hekim in 1849, or the first translation of a novel in 1854, Vartan Pasha's Topal Şeytan Hikayesi, the Diable Boiteux of Les Sages. Now, Sahak Abro, the translator of Voltaire and of the treatise on political economy, and Vartan Pasha were both members of the Ottoman Academy, Encümeni Danish, founded in 1851. Now, Vartan Pasha was really extraordinary person. It's really sad that I cannot show you the pictures of his Armeno-Turkish biography of Napoleon Bonaparte of 1,500 pages. And the work wasn't even finished, and it was compiled from 20 different sources. Now, after the middle of the 19th century, more and more Armenian translators started publishing their works in two scripts, including Vartan Pasha. Also of his Napoleon work, there is an Ottoman version in Arabic script, but much smaller. What about European residents? Some European residents in Istanbul had acquired very sound knowledge of Turkish. And there is one interesting example of collaboration between translators, between the famous Ottoman writer Ahmed Mithat Effendi and a German resident of Istanbul, Wilhelm Wiesenthal. And they translated a work on Cemil, the hero of the Caucasus in the struggle against the Russians. And it's very interesting. Maybe I may quote two sentences in Turkish in this, more or less focused on Arabic environment. He found a term for collaboration, sayi müşterek. Sayi müşterek usulü bizi bu işte o suretle mescü tefhid eylemiştir ki ikimizden bir Alman kadar Almanca ve bir Osmanlı kadar dahi Osmanlıca bilir bir muktedir mütercim çıkmıştır. Yeah, so the Ottoman doesn't know German, and the German does not know Ottoman as an Ottoman, but together they are forming a powerful translator. Now, this method, collaborative translations are relatively rare. The only case I remember is a attempt at translating a history of the Crusades, but of which only the first volume was published. Now, what can I say about the Ottoman translators in the second half of the 19th century? The Muslim translators, with the rise of a new type of translators, government officials trained in the translation chamber, tercüme odası, or graduates of modern schools more or less proficient in French, the dominant Western source language, and especially the School of Administration, Mektebi Mülkiye, founded in 1859, produced numerous, at time very active translators, and also the Lycée of Galatasaray, founded in 1868, where the French was the language of instruction. In many cases, translations were just what they called a tecrübe-i kalem. But on the other hand, nearly all great names of Ottoman literature and intellectual life have produced translations. Shinazi, Zia Pasha, Nami Kemal, Şemseddin Sami, Ahmed Mithat Effendi, and many others. Turkish readers also possess, thanks to Ahmed Vefik Pasha, who was trained in French elite schools in Paris, because his father was a diplomat, though they have an almost complete set of Molière's comedies. Ahmed Vefik Pasha is also remarkable in as far as he, unlike other translators, only translated respectable works well established in the French literary canon, Molière, Fénelon, Voltaire, etc. The Ottomans also owed him a translation from Çağatay, Eastern Turkish, from Abul Ghazi's Shajarai Turki, 1663. Now, this is a unique case since Çağatay was not considered as a foreign language by the Ottomans. It had to be translated. It was easily accessible, and there were even Ottoman poets who had composed verses in Çağatay. Now, translations from other languages, we could mention Greek. Now, translations from Greek were usually made by Greeks themselves, with the notable exception of the Albanian Naim Bey Frasheri, 1846 to 1900, who was the same as his brother Şemseddin Sami, a graduate of a Greek high school. The Frasheri brothers, Naim and Sami Bey, were to play a particularly important role in Turkish intellectual history. So it's a pity that I cannot show the translations. Unlike their predecessors, the Phanariots, these translators, the Muslim translators I had mentioned, were seldom polyglot. The case of Beşir Fuat, 1851 to 1887, who has left translations from 3 different languages. Unfortunately, none of them important. French, English, and German, not the languages, the translations, is exceptional. 90% of translations from the second half of the 19th century were made from the French, including works of famous English or German authors. For example, none of the Ottoman versions of Robinson Crusoe was made from English. Those who were able to translate from other less-known languages often held a sort of monopoly. Now, since we are here in London, a few words about translations from English, a minor language at that time in the Ottoman context.
Professor Strauss, if I may just say, this is not a protest from an Englishman in the light of what you just said. But 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Yes. For example, it's interesting to see that a general history, Tarihi Umumi, was translated from English from a textbook by the Chambers brothers in Edinburgh, and the author said yes, because English historians are better in research than the others. So I hope this can console you a little bit. Mehmet Tahir, a Bosnian, was a specialist of German, so he translated several works, but also of totally forgotten authors. What is important, he translated the military works of von der Goltz Pasha, the famous Persian general who's played an important role for the Ottoman Arabic and Persian. Of course, there are the translations comparable to those made from Latin and Greek in Europe, not very important from classical authors, but Rifa Tahtawi's Takhlis al-Abriz was in an abridged version presented to Muhammad Ali Pasha, and one of the most interesting books I've studied recently, Khaireddin Pasha's Aqwam al-Masalik fi Ma'rifat Ahwal al-Mamalik. So because this is not Ibn Khaldun or a classical author, but it is a treatise on reform, and reforms in European states are viewed very favorably by the authors. Now, 2 words on translation from the local languages. Now, from Armenian, the first translation appeared only in 1913, and it was, of course, made by Armenians. Kurdish is also an interesting case. There is one great sort of national epic, Mamuzin, that had been written at the end of the 17th century. There are several Turkish Ottoman translations of it. The last one published in 1906, but all of them remained in manuscript. But we have to understand this because the original could be printed only in 1919, during the years of the armistice, where the Kurdish language was not prescribed anymore. So I can now conclude. In general, I have to say this, most 19th century translations have become obsolete after the language revolution, mentioned also by Ekmeleddin Bey, the originally called Dil Inkilabe, and later after the purification, Dil Devrimi. There are very few translations that have become classics. You know, there are, I don't know, for the case of English, but for example in Germany, the Shakespeare translations by Schlegel and Tieck furnish almost, proverbs commonly known in Germany. Now something the like doesn't exist in the Turkish case. Ahmed Vefik Pasha's Molière adaptations being the exceptions. They can be performed even today. Now, interesting case is also a translation, the first translation by a woman in the Ottoman Empire, Fatma Aliye's translation of Georges Honet's novel Volonté under the title Meram. It has been reprinted in Latin script recently, but it is sort of monument of feminist literary activity, and this was the reason and perhaps not the content. Although a number of famous men of letters was engaged in this activity, we have to admit in retrospect that much energy has been wasted during that period. But as a whole, even minor figures among these individuals deserve our attention. So I have tried to count the number of translators in the second half of the 19th century and found about 150 names, but only, say, 1/4 of them are also biographically existent. For others, they are just the names. So it is time to include and integrate these Ottoman translators into repertories, encyclopedias, etc. Because it's a shame there is a dictionary of interpreters or translators published some years ago, and there is just one single Turkish translator mentioned. So this has to change, because these translators have made an extremely important contribution to the dissemination of ideas and to the globalization of knowledge. Thank you very much.
I will continue straight on with our third speaker, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Aydin, Professor of Global History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I notice he describes his research as focusing on the political and intellectual history of the modern world from an interdisciplinary global history perspective, using archives in multiple languages. And I think we would all be impressed by that. He's been serving as one of the co-editors of the Columbia UP book series on intellectual and global studies. He's well known for his book, The Idea of the Muslim World, published by Harvard in 2017, and for an earlier book, The Politics of Anti-Westernism in Asia. His title is The Politics of Translating European Science and Ideas into Islamicate Languages during the Era of Colonialism and Decolonization.
Thank you to the host for your hospitality, wonderful meals, and good conversation. What I thought I should do is that as someone who studied with Professor Ekmeleddin Ihsanoglu some long time ago, about 30 years ago, just to think about the politics of the translation in the last 150 years, and what we can do as scholars who work on translation to offer a more inclusive global paradigm. What I would maybe to give a summary of my argument is I will suggest that we need a big paradigm change in this literature, and one important paradigm change is about the terms East and West. In fact, the translation movement coined these terms for a particular purpose of both colonialism and decolonization, but we are for various reasons, we are stuck, or we are staying with these terms, and these terms themselves are actually have a much longer life than I expected in my life, in the sense that civilizationalism now is the one that is the most discussed topic to understand international politics from India to China. And I wanted to get your feedback and help in thinking through this issue. But I want to start with this story. A story is about me. So about 150 years ago, in 1867, 68, these two men were in London, somewhere around here. And we always tell each other this story when I was growing up in Turkey, that even though Namık Kemal, the great Ottoman intellectual, is also considered the kind of founding figure of Ottoman Enlightenment, was in the same city with Karl Marx. They never met. But when we told this story as a Turkish citizen, we always have a tone of regret. So we thought that Namık Kemal would have a lot to learn from Marx. So this is an idea of translation. So the Europe represents superior knowledge, including in humanities and social sciences. And it's so sad that Namık Kemal didn't learn from Marx to translate. But I will tell you, like looking back, the opposite was true. And in fact, the scholarship on global intellectual history will tell you that Marx had a lot to learn from Namık Kemal. In fact, Namık Kemal is the one who is famous for his brilliant critique of Ernest Renan's speech on Islam and science. He's famous as a kind of critique of Orientalists in his age. Is a very famous line. It says, "The West knows nothing of the Orient," which became an edited book recently. And the wisdom of the global intellectual history is to say that Enlightenment that we always attribute to Europe actually have global roots. So all of your scholarship actually shows how much of global translation of ideas contributed to European Enlightenment in the 18th century. But then go further, saying that the bigger Enlightenment actually happened outside of Europe in the 19th century with figures like Namık Kemal. And if you don't think of Enlightenment as this kind of, I started it, you copy it from me, which is also not true, then Namık Kemal becomes a very interesting figure in terms of his ideas, his synthesis of different intellectual traditions and his legacy. So if this is the case, then how can we understand this politics of translation between different imaginary civilizations? I created this thing about silos: Western, Arabic, Islamic, Indian, Hindu, and Chinese. And all of you show that actually that kind of a separate silos never existed. And Sharak mentioned that humanity has always interacted in different forms. But in the late 19th century, many people began to think like that. They began to separate their own intellectual tradition. And there was various political reasons for it. Even though I'm critical of some of the choices made in that generation, I feel like if I were transported back in 150 years ago today, I would have probably behaved the same way. And I will try to explain why I will behave the same way. So I will try to tell you three different paradigms which came chronologically after each other, but it's still with us. First paradigm is the idea that Europe represents the highest stage of world civilization, and the non-Europeans have to learn from Europe. So you show in this conference that there was always translations among different cultures throughout history, and you can expand it. And there were, certain speed. Sometimes it was more, sometimes less. There were filters, obviously, when you translate. And Mr. Nedevi's talk was very interesting. So the translation, we forget that between Arabic and Indian Vedic traditions. But there's something that will change in the late 19th century. The translation will become more systematic, more comprehensive, and it will turn into an ideology, and it will turn into one-way traffic. One-way traffic mostly from Europe to the non-European languages. Our colleague described about the Orientalists. Yes, there's a lot of Orientalist interest in scholarship, but Orientalists in the late 19th century do not treat non-European tradition as something that they need to learn from to build their own future. It's more about colonial control. And we have to understand this is the age of European colonialism, and part of it is this idea of standard of civilization. So when we think about racism that is part of colonialism, we always think about skin color racism. But the most important racialization has happened through the language of civilization, that the Ottomans and Arabs and Indians and Chinese were categorized as semi-civilized, and they were literally not equal in international law. We know that there were unequal treaties, capitulations, but individuals were not equal. Who can migrate, who can marry whom, everything was connected to this notion of civilization. In response, what non-Europeans did all over the world, including Muslim societies, is that instead of rejecting Europe's language of civilization and enlightenment, they embraced it, redefined it, and they turned it into a very exciting project of future-oriented humanism. And this is the choice they made. And it could be something about their own kind of reading of the zeitgeist and the spirit of history. So I put a couple of books to kind of highlight what I mean by it. So Unfabling the East by Jürgen Osterhammer actually talks about how 18th century Europe had a better, more open-ended interest in the non-European societies. But then he says that they closed in the 19th century. So there's some sort of more of an interest on the East. And when I was listening to your papers on Quran or Europe's interest in others, I always thought about this book, whether how you can engage with that conversation. But when the 19th century comes in, we have more people like Rofara Tahtawi, who was a French delegation's imam in Paris, or Namik Kemal, who was a friend of Theodore Kassab, and they had dinners with Alexander Dumas in Paris, but lived here, that they embrace enlightenment as not something imposed on them, but as something that is that they also think representing a universal truth. And we should not think of their interest in enlightenment only as a kind of defensive mechanism, that they were told that somehow Ottomans and the Arabs and Muslims are inferior, semi-civilized outside of Europe, and apologetically they have to say, oh, I belong to Europe, I am civilized, I do this. There is something that goes beyond that, and they immediately go in a very Hegelian mode of imagining a future where racism and imperialism don't exist, and they can shape their own future. And in that context, they get very disturbed by Orientalism. And this is the book that I highly recommend. This is Europe Knows Nothing About Orient, about Ottoman writings of critique of Orientalism. But if any South Asian would know, Sayyid Ahmed Khan's fighting with William Hunter, right? And the William Hunter says, according to Islamic law, you're not supposed to be loyal to Queen Victoria. And he's furious. He does the Maqasid al-Sharia thing. And he says, you have no idea what Islamic law is. Let me explain that I can be a Muslim, a humanist, and I can build this Anglo-Mohammedan Oriental college. And I can be loyal to the Queen. And that's some sort of an interest in proving that you are civilized. You fulfill the standard of civilization. You go one step further. And in that context, translation and history of science becomes very important for Muslims, because it's one theory to explain why Muslims are not civilized, why they are fanatic, why they lag behind. So everybody agrees that there is some sort of a gap in terms of the power and developmental level. But you can explain that gap sociologically. Today you can tell China to build roads and bridges. Sometimes civilization and modernity is about infrastructure. But people like Renan and many others say that no, that gap has something to do with your fanaticism, your mentality, that no matter how much translation you do, you will never be civilized. You will never be rational. And we should know Bernard Lewis's book, even much later in response to Edward Said, The Muslim Discovery of Europe, makes that point, saying that Europeans translated and learned from everyone, but Muslims were too lazy, too arrogant. They never showed interest in any other civilization. Hence, they decline. And this leads to this idea of a golden age and decline. So I want to kind of highlight how oppressive that condition is. I teach in my university classes on empire and decolonization, and our current generation students, when they read this generation, including African-American leaders like Du Bois, they're really disturbed because they found them too apologetic, too conciliatory. And one of the students says, like, why can't they say Europeans are colonials and racist and reject them that way, right? Some of the theories of Renan is not about science and Islam and religion. It's about empire. It's about hegemony. But non-Europeans have to go one step ahead. And in that context, they then have to systematically translate everything from the West of Europe. So this becomes a project, an ideology. And you could never be perfect in this. There's always things that you don't translate. That's one thing. But the second important revolution that happens that is at the same time, Muslims, Indians and Chinese also began to translate their own texts. That's why it's not an accident that this institute is built as a manuscript institute. Mr. Zeki Yamani also represent that tradition, right? That you are humanist, you want to build a better future, your own society. But one thing you need to do is to show what contributions you made to the rise of the West, to the modern world, but what humanistic legacy you have in science and philosophy. Thus, there is this excitement about republishing the classics. So the transition becomes a double movement. You transit from Europe to West, but also you transit your own tradition, including Quran, by the way. So there are many Quran translations. The Yusuf Ali, you mentioned Shakespeare. Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation always have a Shakespearean quote to explain a verse. And I also think that Zeki Yamani sponsored Muhammad Esad's translation. There's always this thing to make your own religious tradition, civilization in harmony with enlightenment and modernity and rationality in that regard. So this double translation should not be forgotten. In this stage, non-Europeans, so we're thinking about the East and West, have one interesting strategy that will be crucial for the future reification of these civilizational terms, and that is the argument they made about the hypocrisy of the West. So hypocrisy argument is a very anti-colonial argument, we know from Gandhi, but it also makes a distinction between the good Enlightenment West and a bad non-Enlightenment colonial West. And this may have been one of the reasons why the non-Europeans themselves were very invested in the idea of Europe and the West. And they began to situate themselves. Until 1880s, we do not see much of a big multiple civilizational theory. There's still one single civilization. That was one of the first homework that Ekmeleddin Ihsanoglu gave it to me. He wanted me to look at the first Turkish journals of science, Mecmai Funun, for me to find out what was the discussion on East and West. And I found out that the Mecmai Funun in 1683-85 never used the word Islamic civilization that early. They're committed to enlightenment and civilization. And there's one interesting metaphor by an Ottoman minister who was the father of Fatma Ali, a female translator you mentioned, Cevdet Pasha. He says civilization is like a bride. It's universal. It just picks its location depending on the level of progress of that place. So this beautiful civilization bride was in Arab lands in India, and it moved to Egypt, Greece, now it's in Europe. And he says, but we don't know where it's going to go next. So there's some sort of one singular civilization, and you have the ladders, the steps to climb the civilization, the standard. This paradigm will change. I'm going to skip this part. According to this paradigm, of course, you can always prove that you contributed to the rise of Europe, to the rise of one single civilization. Hence, there's all these scholarship on how much Islamic science contributed to European science and other things. But next paradigm will be important. But before I give you the next paradigm, I still have enough time, I want to show how much of this first paradigm in terms of the success and failure were internalized by historians of science. And we have this very powerful quote from Mr. Aydin who was the first PhD in history of science at Harvard. When he talked about Copernicus, we had a great scholar of Copernicus. He has this line, it says, about Newton, Isaac Newton, but also Ottoman conquest or Ottoman siege of Vienna. He says, even if Ottomans have conquered Vienna, it wouldn't have made any difference in the world history because they were unaware of Isaac Newton. If you do not know, you haven't translated scientific revolution and Newton, your military victories didn't matter. I mean, this is the kind of world history based on the triumph of scientific revolution. And when I talk to historians of science, like my colleague here, Harun, I think you will laugh at it. To think that Isaac Newton's book have changed the world. And in fact, Harun's book, I will highly recommend, makes the opposite argument of Aydin Sayılı, because Aydin Sayılı says that the Muslims and Ottomans were very scholastic. That's why they didn't appreciate Isaac Newton. And you have to read Harun's argument to see the opposite explanation of the opposite. Maybe Isaac Newton was very scholastic, and even though nobody read his book, he still did his research. So the second paradigm, it comes in 1880s and 1890s, is the paradigm of multiple world civilizations which had complementary values. This paradigm has anti-colonial roots, and it has it's well known with regard to India, China, and Japan, but it also has Arab Muslim roots. So according to first paradigm, non-Europeans actually improve on the European knowledge, and I want to highlight one important book by Antoine Firmin, the Haitian diplomat, and a minister called The Equality of the Human Races, which shows someone who is from Haiti, a non-Europe, is better than Jean-Jacques Rousseau or any other Europeans. And this is 1880, and he wrote a theoretical book arguing that there is no actual racial differences and all human beings are equal by nature. Humanity will get to that level by 1960s, right, in terms of the UNESCO and the Declaration. So there is some sort of a non-European embrace of enlightenment, but also improvement on it, that it actually makes it better in terms of humanities and social sciences. But I want to focus on the second paradigm, says that yes, there were multiple world civilizations, and in these multiple world civilizations, each civilization has its own virtues and values. That's why I was very fascinated by your description of the idea of spirituality East, because I was wondering where did this idea that Asia is spiritual. There's no reason to argue that, but it may have been something with Biruni and others too. And he says that we have to create a balance between the kind of achievements of the West and achievement of the East to create a better future. Swami Vivekananda's talk in in the Chicago World Parliament of Religions is kind of well-known point there that up to his time, the Hinduism is considered this kind of inferior religion. It's not a world religion, but he makes Hinduism so well-defined with his speech that he actually steals the show of this parliament, which was supposed to prove the superiority of the Christianity. We have Panasians talk about complementarity of East and West, and this man Okakura Kakuza I studied, who has the book on ideals of the East, and this is Tagore, Ananda Kumaraswamy, and this adds on to the critique of Orientalism, and I want to note that this will become an important paradigm for the rethinking history of Islamic science and translation too. So in this paradigm, even if there aren't any perfect translation from West to East, it's okay. That the Easterners will translate from the West science and materialism and technology, and the West have to start translating from the East spirituality and morality. The sort of complementarity of it. And the future will be a synthesis of the East and West. So there's a redefinition of Hegelianism. I want to show how political this was, right? So this thing that always attributed to Gandhi, what do you think about Western civilization? And he says, I think it will be a good idea, is actually uttered sometime around 1910s. There's no actual record of it. In this mode of saying that we have been always emulating the Europe, but this was a mistake. There are good things in Europe and bad things in Europe, so we have to be careful about translation. And I have seen this lymphatic metaphor is that translation is like food. And Asia and the East has a body, and you translate from Europe what will make your body strong. If you get everything, then you become obese. You have to be selective and what you need to translate in that regard. Third paradigm, which is important for my argument, is that the third paradigm goes into one step further, and it's not everyone, but it's many Asians began to go the next step by Henry Corbin, René Guénon, which will influence Seyd Hussein Nasser, to say that, and I heard it from Seyd Hussein Nasser directly, what you translate and learn from the West may not be a medicine, it may also be a poison. And it says that maybe you put a break on the translations, and in order to save the future of humanity, and this paradigm developed in the 30s, less Western translation, more Eastern translation. So if the second paradigm makes, with the Theosophists, East as a teacher, you have to teach the West morality. In the third translation, it says that you can only build a better future if you actually undo the damage caused by the West. So this time the Western science becomes a kind of a poison more than a medicine. And Sayyid Hussein Nasr says that it's good that Islamic science and Western science do not meet. They should be separate. How is this related? And I'm going to explain this in the next 5 minutes. And I want to go back to the year 1956, when Mr. Zeki Yamani was a Harvard MA student in law, and Sayyid Hussein Nasr was doing his PhD in history of science. And Hussein Nasr, I interviewed him, he said that they were hanging out. They were going to Friday prayers together with also Aga Khan there as a student. I will say the both of them maybe, and more of Zeki Yamani, represent the best of the first and the second paradigm. That the Muslims have to translate what they need to learn. The direction should be open, but it should be both ways. And the Muslims have to also know their own classics. And the goal is this very clear post-colonial humanism, 50s to what we describe to make a world after empire, to make a better world, world making after empire in that paradigm. They may have agreed, but Sayyid Hussein Nasr will go one step further, and I want to highlight this in this moment. And he meets, for various reasons, maybe some other people will do that too, one of the theos of his family, Ananda Kumaraswamy, who was at Boston. And there's a story about his tennis ball falling into the garden, and becomes like the adopted son of Kumaraswamy family. And afterwards, I talked to Rama Kumaraswamy, Ananda Kumaraswamy's son, and he always said Hussein is our brother. After that, he develops this idea that Western science had the poison to begin with. And he literally told once he was a guest in Ekmeleddin Ihsanoglu's class, maybe Hoja will remember that too. He said that we made the mistake of translating unconsciously and translating all the bad things, and we just have to revive to be authentic. So the third paradigm says that Islamic science has its own essence. There are things that you cannot translate. West failed, modernity failed. This has something to do with World War II, Holocaust, atomic bomb, and we need to think about Islamic science and the Western science as two separate traditions with two alternative values, and the Western science, because its modernity is poisonous. And this leads to his own writings on history of Islamic science. And I found out that in 1976-77, when the city of London hosts the biggest art exhibit called the World of Islam Festival, opened by Queen Elizabeth, the main text was actually this type of theosophical civilizational text, which I was surprised. Actually, he gave a talk on the encounter of man and the nature in that regard, which will lead to some of the problems with the third paradigm. And I find it ironic that Sayyid Hussein Nasr was in Iran as an advisor to the king. So the third paradigm doesn't have to lead to conservatism and fundamentalism. In fact, some of these ideas by Darish Shayagan and Hussein Nasr was adopted by Iranian monarchy, Pahlavi monarchy. But it was also adopted by the opposition, including by Jalal Ali Ahmed, Ali Shariati, and many others. So they were the ones who were making that we have to stop the emulation of the West, do less translation, and revive our authentic tradition, go back to our roots. And to go back to Muhammad Kemal and Karl Marx, when Michel Foucault went to Iran in 1978 as a journalist, of course he's a post-Marxist leftist person, tried to understand the emerging Iranian revolution. He wanted to understand Iran, and he had a reading list. And reading list is 70% theosophists. Henry Corbin is one of them. Louis Massignon is another one, which I wouldn't highly recommend. I wouldn't recommend to read that list to understand what's happening in Iran, but it also shows how much of this paradigm of East-West and reviving the East to save the world became dominant in that moment. So where do we go from here? Here's my 25 minutes. Sorry, I don't repeat this. What I do see that is a mission for us is that we see the shadow of these three paradigms in the contemporary debate on world order, world disorder, civilizationalism. And if you just, some of you just came from China, they were telling me, and I was very surprised how modern Chinese communist state, for various reasons, and we have to understand what these reasons are, began to embrace and articulate the idea of civilizationalism. That China is a civilization of Confucianism, and it has its own alternative values. If there's a crisis in the modern world, it's because of the failure of the Westphalia and the modern Western civilization. In India, for example, Modi, and I think you implied Modi and Hinduism in this regard, now inherit Vivekananda's tradition and try to present India as a guru to the world. So India's mission to the rest of the world. The big puzzle for me, of course, is that on the other hand, the first idea of civilizationalism as a progress is also out there, right? China is promoting Belt and Road Initiative, the technology, and now in America, we are told very openly, be careful about Chinese students and international scholars, that they don't steal science. So in some ways we are, by the university, we are told not to translate from West to East, right? That the Chinese can be getting the secrets from the West. And China is better than the West in some ways, technology. And the things that Namu Kemal will praise, roads and hotels, and with the Roads and Belt Initiative. So the idea of a single world civilization is out there, but there is a problem with the idea of multiple civilizations that I see everywhere. In some ways, this category of East and West was a product of the transition movement and that politics of colonialism and decolonization. But at some point, it could have been a vanishing mediator, vanishing categories. We could have come up with a better big paradigms. We need to rethink of what we can do, what that new paradigm could be, because we knew that the East and West is just a convention to use, and maybe with all of our help and thinking together, we can offer a new alternative paradigm. I will end it here. Thank you. All right. Do I have anything else?
So, questions from the floor?
May I?
Please do, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Well, I have some observations and questions to all the three learned speakers, since Professor Oglu is not right now, so it will be directed to him afterwards. Related to Professor Strauss is when he talked about the Turkish translation of Robinson Crusoe from English. So whenever we find that legacy of related to philosophers autodidactus, in historical parlance, it is related to the first production in Arabic of the first philosophical novel, that is Hayy ibn Yaqtan by Ibn Tufail, which was translated into Latin under the title Philosophers Autodidactus. So nearly all the versions in Arabic as well as in translation in English, when they focus on the analysis of Robinson Crusoe, usually they relate the thing with philosophers autodidactus. So is it the same thing in regard to the Turkish translation? So this is what is simply the question. Regarding Professor Aydin, thank you very much for such a brilliant topic, brilliant talk related to Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, his legacy of defense and all that. One point that augments this vision is his translation of his book related to the the revolt of 1957, Asbab al-Baghawat Hind. So he actually corrected some wrong visions attributed to how to interpret that revolt. So this way, his book was instrumental in revisiting or correcting certain wrong notions prevalent in the English Academy at the time. So that was again something very fabulous. But let me differ a little bit from your point of view regarding Vivekananda's vision of India, which presented in the well-known Chicago Congress. I think it was more related to the Vedic India than to, I'm sorry to say, modern India in some specific perspectives To some of the things, Vedic India was not focused on canonical Hinduism. It was very much close to, or had much more affinity to the Upanishadic wisdom, the Vedic wisdom. But now I think the things which have unfolded of late, they are more reflective of the philosophy of Manusmriti. So that I think that's the difference between Vivekananda's India and the present. Of course, but this doesn't hinder the idea of India to be Vishwaguru in its projection. So this is my observation. I'm very much honored. I feel myself honored to have heard Professor Ekmeleddin Ihsanoglu. I recollect the moment we had been together in the UFA Congress, which was held, I think, 6-7 years back. And of course, I recollect your remarks, your observations regarding your visit to our university, Al-Furqan Muslim University, in the Department of Islamic Studies. So it's an honor to be to hear you, sir. But I have a little bit to worry. It's related to the coinage aspect of terminology, especially in regard to the sciences. Although translation must be faithful, here we have the different theories of translation. The invisible translator, primarily the translator should be invisible. But and this, I think, assumes a greater significance in relation to the scientific domain. So here there is one example that is worrying me, like proposing the Arabic, or say in this sequence, the Ottoman or the Turkish word terminology for syphilis, that is Daul Ifrinj. I think the pure scientific and etymological aspect in this sequence gets disturbed. This appears to me, in regard to, since I had this example, so I think this disturbs this equilibrium of having the balance, perfect balance between the scientific tuning, avoiding or just standing guard against the etymological discourse with some assumptive or stereotypes regarding sciences. Thank you, sir, very much.
We have.
طيب أنا أسأل باللغة العربية دكتور أيدن. شكرا جزيلا، كانت محاضرة قيمة، وكذلك الدكتور ستراوس، وطبعا أستاذنا الكبير البروفيسور إحسان الدين أوغلو. ولكن سؤالي الدكتور أيدن، لأن الموضوع رائع جدا في مسألة الحركية والحركة الموجود، التدافع بين الاستشراق والاستغراب أو بين الشرق والغرب. وطبعا أشرت إلى مكمن الحقيقة المشكلة، يعني والمشكلة كما ذكرها المستشرق الكبير الموجود في أمريكا زكاري لوكمان في كتابه حول الاستشراق الجديد، يتحدث عن إنتاج الثنائية هذه المحورية شرق غرب، لأن هي ثنائية أسطورية شرق غرب إيست ويست. فأعتقد أن فك هذه الثنائية بالتنقيب عليها تاريخيا، لأنه هي الحقيقة تحريف لجغرافية أرسطو، لما أرسطو تصور ثلاثية للعالم، ثم بعد ذلك في القرن ال18 والقرن ال19 مع حركة الأنوار الغرب لدوافع استعمارية شطبها إلى قسمين، ومن ثم هذا عقل الغرب المتنور وذاك العقل الميتافيزيقي الشرقي الغارق في الروحانية. هذه أولا. فلذلك أعتقد أنه هذا الأمر، لا تعتقد أنه هناك لابد أن تكون هناك دراسات حول تطور هذه الثنائية، ما تظاهرات، من استغلها. ثم فيه نقطة أخرى مهمة، مسألة المعرفة، سافوار، العلم. المعرفة كما يقول الدكتور عبد الوهاب المسيري حيزت، يعني التحيز، فكرة تحيز المعرفة، المصطلحات كل ما أنتجه، وهذا أنا لم يتسنى لي الوقت في مسألة ترجمات إلى اللغات اللاتينية، فيه انحراف بحيث استغلت خاصة المؤلفات في الطب والجغرافيا والفلك، وجيرت المصطلحات أو حرفت لصالح مصطلحات لاتينية أو مصطلحات غربية تتركز فيها المعرفة، بحيث كأن المعرفة يؤتى بها من الشرق ثم تصدر من جديد بمضامين غربية. وأخيرا ميشيل فوكو لديه مذكرات في طهران، مذكرات سرية لم يفصح عنها. هذه المذكرات أعتقد أنها مهمة جدا، وقد ذكرتها جريدة لوموند في وقت من الأوقات إبان وفاة ميشيل فوكو، تتحدث عن اعترافاته بعمق الحضارة الشرقية عموما والفارسية، فأعتقد أنه هذه كذلك لابد أن نبحث فيها. شكرا.
I notice that we do have Professor Ihsanoglu back with us, and it's just been suggested that we might now prioritize any questions from the floor to Professor Ihsanoglu. So if there are any questions for him, please raise your hand.
طبعا أستاذنا الكبير، أنا فيه كتاب أشرفت عليه في منظمة الإيسيسكو إبان الأستاذ الدكتور عبد العزيز التويجري لما كان مشرفا عليها. كان هناك كتاب حررته اسمه الطب الأندلسي، الطب الأندلسي بين التجريب والنظر. هذا يتحدث أستاذنا عن طب الزهراوي وابن زهر وابن رشد، وكيف أن هذه المصطلحات التجريبية اللي تحدثت أنت الكثير منها في كتابه الكليات في الطب والمداواة النفوس، وشرحها أن الكثير من المصطلحات الطب المعاصرة مرت عن طريق الأندلس، وهذه المصطلحات التي ذكرتها بالذات الكثير منها موجود يعني في الكليات في الطب لابن رشد. لكن المشكلة الكبرى أنه حتى تسمية ابن رشد ومصطلح ابن رشد في حد ذاته أفيروس غيب يعني. فهذه المصطلحات كيف نستطيع أن ننقب عن أصول ترجمتها وأصولها العربية في تطور الطب اللاتيني والطب الغربي عموما؟ شكرا. سؤال واضح؟ الصورة ثابتة. واضح سؤال أستاذنا؟
هذا موجه لي؟
إيه نعم.
شكرا على
الله يبارك.
هذا الاهتمام بالورقة البسيطة التي قدمتها. المصطلح العلمي أو المصطلح التقني هو العمود الفقري لأي لغة ناضجة وأي لغة متقدمة. وفي تاريخ الحضارة الإسلامية حركة الترجمة التي بدأت في العهد العباسي واستمرت لمدة 3 قرون أو ما يزيد قليلا عنها، نجحت في اشتقاق كثير من الكلمات التي لم تكن معروفة في اللغة العربية أو لدى العرب قبل الإسلام. ولما جاء المترجمون في أواخر العهد الأموي وفي بداية العهد العباسي ترجموا وعربوا كثير من الكلمات واشتقوا كلمات جديدة، وهذه صارت تعبر عن ثراء اللغة العربية وقدرتها الفوكابولارية إذا صح التعبير، بالإضافة إلى قدرتها الاشتقاقية الموجودة. فصار ما صار، وكانت هناك اللغة العربية منتشرة من الجغرافيا الإسلامية جميعا. ولكن عندما خرج الأوروبيون من دائرة الكلاسيكية السابقة للإسلام واللاحقة للإسلام، جابهتهم معاني كثيرة جديدة اكتشفوا مثلا في التشريح أعضاء في الجسد لم تكن معروفة من قبل، كال... كال... عفوا كالبروستاتا مثلا لم يكن يعرفها الأطباء المسلمون أو العرب. البنكرياس لم يكن معروف لديهم، فكان لابد من تسميتها أو استخدام اللفظ الذي توافق عليه الأوروبيون. عندما ازدادت الكشوفات العلمية وخاصة في مجال الطب والكيمياء، هناك حاجة لوضع أسماء وتعريب أسماء حتى يمكن إدراج هذه الكلمات في النصوص واستخدامها في المدارس. هنا نجد ملاحظات معينة، لنا ملاحظات معينة، أن مثلا في الجغرافيا الحاجة إلى اصطلاحات جديدة أقل في ال في ال في الرياضيات مثلا، في الحساب، في الجبر، فيما إلى ذلك، أقل منها في علوم أخرى. فالحركة العثمانية التي بدأت من القرن السابع عشر واستمرت كل هذه القرون أنتجت الكثير. وأنا هنا أدعو إلى، لا أقول أن هذه أهم من هذه أو هذه أقل أهمية من هذه، هذا غير وارد لدي، كلهم يعني ذات قيمة عالية، ولكن أنا أشير إلى التوازي بين الحركتين. وأشير إلى نقطة أخرى، أنه يجب الآن وخاصة هذه الندوات التي قامت بها الفرقان تضع أمامنا مسؤولية جديدة، أننا عثرنا على كنز كان مغلق مختفي. فكانت الدعوة هي أن يكون هناك اهتمام متزايد بهذا الأمر، لأنه سيوضح نتائج كثيرة جدا، وهي علاقة الإسلام بالغرب. وعلاقة الإسلام بالغرب ما زالت يكتنفها كثير من الغموض، وتحتاج إلى إعطاء فرصة أكبر للدارسين. ومن هنا أقول لقد استقرت الدراسات الفترة العباسية التي وصفت بأنها ال- ال- العهد الذهبي للإسلام، للثقافة. أنا أعتقد أن الاهتمام بهذه الفترة يمثل عهد الانفتاح العالم الإسلامي على الغرب، ويصحح كثير من المفاهيم الخاطئة. مثلا القول بأن لم يكن هناك حركة فكرية تنتقل من الغرب أو من أوروبا إلى العالم الإسلامي قبل نابليون. هنا عندما ترى أن في منتصف القرن السابع عشر كتب تترجم في الطب، في الجغرافيا وفي غيرها باللغات الإسلامية من اللغات الأوروبية اللاتينية والفرنسية.
Thank you, Ekmo, for that very long and clear exposition. We are nearing the time we have available now. I feel we should just give the floor a chance to come to Professor Strauss or Professor Aydin again, since we interjected at a certain point. So could I just invite further questions?
Thank you very much indeed for these fascinating papers for all of you. First, I want to address Professor Strauss, and my question is, you mentioned Tahtawi and Khairuddin, and have you ever compared between the Egyptian experience of translation from European language and Turkish one? Because according to the dates that you mentioned, it seems that Turkey is far behind the Egyptian experience. You mentioned that Italian remained as the main language of instruction in the medical, in the Turkish schools until the 1830. Am I right? something like that. Because in the,
Something like that.
yes, in the Egyptian experience, they shifted from Italian to French since 1812. And that's first. Second, you mentioned that until 1868, the main language of teaching medicine in Galatasaray School of Medicine was French.
No, not Galatasaray Lycée.
Lycée.
It
I'm
was
sorry,
not a
I'm quite
medical
sorry.
school.
Because
No, this. Well, yes, but go ahead.
let's finish first. Because in the Egyptian experience, they shifted from French into Arabic since 1838. So I think that there is a kind of gap between the Egyptian and the Turkish experience concerning translation and focusing in European languages. That's first. And second, could you please tell us if there is any scientific mission, official scientific missions to Europe, as was the case of Muhammad Ali in Egypt, because as according to the Egyptian experience, it was the members of those missions who played a significant role in the translation endeavor during the 19th century. That's my first.
Thank you.
And just a small comment for Professor Aydin. I like your paper very much, and like you using Jacques Derrida deconstructivist vision in order to deal with decentralization and Eurocentrism, cultural relativism. I just want to mention one book that I read and I found fascinating, is that the Oriental Enlightenment of John James Clark.
Yeah.
It is of very, very high importance related to what you mentioned, mainly in the philosophical level. Thank you very much.
Yes, but could I say a few words to Professor Nadawi's question concerning Robinson first? There are two translations. The one was made from Arabic, and the other one from French. And the Arabic was quite curious because in the introduction it said it was translated from Kutubi Garbiye, and the dot was wrong. You know, it was from Kutubi Arabiye, and I found out it was actually a version of Robinson translated by the missionaries in Malta, and this Arabic version of Robinson Crusoe, of course, abridged, and it was translated into Turkish. I could, because this Arabic translation is now available on the internet, I could check this. And the second one, by Şemseddin Sami, was translated from a French textbook for schools. It is also a shortened version, and this French book was extremely popular in the 19th century. It was translated into Greek, modern Greek, and other languages. Şemseddin Sami says, yes, he wanted to translate this because I know it's used in Ottoman schools, and now I give them a Turkish translation so the students can compare and learn how to translate. But on the other hand, this is an extremely important book because in the long introduction, Şemseddin Sami for the first time suggests that translators should also imitate European syntax to make short sentences, you know. And this, because up to that period, you know, involved sentences were usual in Ottoman Turkish in the classical style. So this is, and of course, Hay ibn Yaqzan, I don't remember when it was discovered as a source of Robinson Crusoe, but I think it was a bit later. It didn't play any role for these Ottoman versions of Robinson. But it was the person of Robinson. For example, Shamseddin Sami doesn't even mention that it was written by a writer called Daniel Defoe, the author. It was the Robinson, as they pronounce it in French, which mattered. And now to your question, yes, I have dealt with this issue, the translations in Egypt, but translations into Turkish. And as I said initially, or if I tried to show, initially Turkish translation, especially of historical works, were much more important than the Arabic ones, because also the official Gazette Al-Waqai Al-Misriya was bilingual, and it is said that the Arabic was translated from the Turkish, so the principal language was Turkish. But in Egypt, of course, one has to distinguish between scientific works, which were translated into Arabic usually, not always. There are, except Ekmeleddin knows much better than me, but modern history, contemporary history, was translated into Turkish. So the history of Catherine the Great, the pseudo-autobiography of Napoleon Bonaparte, and other works on or Botta's history of Italy. It is said, yes, it is Botta's History of Italy, but actually it's only the first volume, and it deals with the Napoleonic occupation of Italy. So all this is more or less Napoleonic. But the interesting thing is that, after the fall of Selim III in 1808, or he was murdered in 1808, there was this standstill in the Ottoman Empire. There were no, even these translations made were not printed. And so Muhammad Ali or Mehmed Ali Pasha took up. He accepted, and he had it printed. So I think Turkish translations printed in Egypt started very early. I don't know whether the Vesaya Nami Seferiye, translated by Shani Sani, was the first book printed by the Bulak Press. I have to check this. But I think, and second question, Rifa Tahtawi's case is of course special. Here the Egyptians were the pioneers. They were the first to send these students to Paris. But later on, some decades later, an Ottoman school was even founded in Paris, but it was not very successful. So the more dynamic power as far as reforms are concerned at that time was Egypt, was Muhammad Ali's Egypt.
It will be my paper, so I invite you to tomorrow.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Perhaps one last question, if there is.
But there was a question for you.
Sorry.
No, I can combine my response if we get one last question. I was going to respond, which I will combine.
Biggish question, so I think I'm better off having conversations with you after.
Okay.
Please.
So thank you. I will combine the comments by Mr. Nadavi and my colleague there. So once you have a new unequal structure of Europe advance and you're falling behind, the translations become very purposeful, that you try to understand the secrets of Europe's progress so that you translate and then you save or liberate your own society from subjugation. Right? So there is a very systematic effort, and it can also go to local literature and culture. That goes to the question that Europe is not only science, so you have to get the culture more holistically. So there is more of an attempt, but this is, of course, is a never complete process. I mean, no matter how much you run, you always have more things to translate. And I sometimes talk to editors. I am an editorial board on Turkish presses, and they always ask me, what are the things that we should translate from Europe and America that Turks should know? And I'm also advisor to Columbia University Press. They never ask this question, like what is it in Asia and India that we need to translate? This rarely occurs to them. But when in that regard, I think you asked the question of Occidentalism. I think the non-Europeans' discourse on Europe is rarely comparable to Orientalism. Orientalism has this kind of control purpose. They create this ideal model of Europe, and even when they criticize, when they say moral bankruptcy of the Western policy towards the East, which is a famous book by the young Ottoman intellectual Ahmet Reza, was a head of the Ottoman Parliament, and this is the one I thought Malik bin Nevi read. If you read that book, it only talks about colonialism, racism. There's not a single mention of women's clothing, alcohol, gambling, or some, the things that you think that the Muslims are going to be conservative when they talk about moral bankruptcy of the West. It's just really big humanist questions in that regard. So on that issue, that I want to link it to, again, the question of India, East, and Islamic civilization with regard to the Vedic or Indian. I do agree with you that Vivekananda's conception of India is Vedic, and it's completely different than Modi's conception of India as a guru. But I found, again, with regard to translation from the Islamic classics to modern world, how reference to India becomes quite a teaching moment. So initially, when Muslim intellectuals wanted to show that Islam is very enlightened and rational, they got embarrassed about astrology, dream interpretation, all of the things that they didn't want to talk about, even though Europe had that too. And one of the things that they were trying to not emphasize very much is this aspect that Professor Nedevi talked about, the mysticism. And in fact, many of them say mysticism is an import from India, as if it's a bad thing. But this changes very quickly. So once we get to 1920s and 30s, almost all Arab intellectuals are Gandhian. And in fact, Egyptian intellectuals this time emphasize exactly how you did it, is the commonality between Islamic thought and Indian civilization to kind of ground this Bandung era solidarity, inter-Asian solidarity. So that also changes very quickly. And vice versa, that both Vivekananda and Gandhi are very positive on the role of Muslims in India. And Gandhi talks about Prophet Muhammad as much as he talks about Jesus, right, in his role model. And nobody in India mentions that how much kind of he thought of Islam and Muslims as part of India. And at some point, the idea of the Indian civilization becomes more Hindu and exclude Muslims. But I think that transition happens much later with RSS and the Hindu fundamentalism. But we have to ask this question whether this transition had this kind of structural flow at the beginning, because this idea of civilizations required that you have to go back to your authentic roots and revive it to be modern, to be universal. And every civilization was supposed to be, Islamic civilization has to go back to Mecca and the classical texts, and Hindus have to do that. So there were some issues at that level to separate Asians who are in solidarity with each other into Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim in the process of decolonization.
One last contribution.
One comment. There is one There is one very important aspect concerning India, because the discovery of Sanskrit as an Indo-European language, was extremely important. So this is an aspect, of course, which does not exist for Islam. And especially in Germany, for example, the philosopher Schopenhauer, he was very much influenced by Indian philosophy, and there was a, say, Hindu mania in romantic Germany for some time, and this the language is important. Also for the Iranians, the fact to be Aryans is still important today. And the last Shah was the Arya Mehr, the Aryan son.
Mr. Chairman, should I remind Professor Oglu of my question, which was directed to him?
Well, I'm feeling we've probably reached the end, to tell you the truth. Could you perhaps talk to him afterwards on that particular point? So, may I, on behalf of you all, thank the three speakers. Professor Ihsanoglu is something of a phantom at the moment, but it's been a great pleasure to have Professor Strauss and Professor Aydin with us. Some excellent questions. I don't know whether it's my position to say this, but I would also very much like to thank Sally and Al-Furqan for doing so much to make this a really notable event with consequences.
I want to applaud them. Thank you. All the staff members.